Shannon sat down with Justice Neil Gorsuch at the Supreme Court and has his response to President Biden's proposed reforms.
And so I just say, be careful.
When asked by the Fox Propaganda Network to weigh in on President Biden's proposed reforms to the United States Supreme Court, the Trump-appointed right-wing Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch, issued a chilling public warning to the president that we have to talk about. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, before I show you a segment of this conversation between Fox News host Shannon Bream and Justice Gorsuch, I do want to remind you of what it is exactly that the president proposed in terms of reform, because they're all wildly popular and should be wildly uncontroversial. So the first one is a constitutional amendment. The No One is Above the Law amendment will make clear that no president is above the law or immune from prosecution for crimes committed while in office. Again, no brainer, right? This is obviously in response to the Trump v. United States recent Supreme Court decision, which gave sweeping, stupid immunity to presidents and former presidents. I'll also add here that constitutional amendments are really challenging in the U.S. because you need a 2/3 supermajority in both chambers, the House and the Senate, and then an even greater supermajority in terms of state legislatures. 3/4 of the 50 state legislatures have to ratify an amendment before it becomes law. That's why we've only had 27 amendments in 250 years, despite literally 12,000 attempts. It's ludicrous, but really, really important that we try. The second proposed reform would be term limits for Supreme Court justices. The president would appoint a justice every 2 years to spend 18 years in active service on the Supreme Court. Right now, Supreme Court justices serve for life or until they retire or until they die, or even less likely, impeachment. And then the third proposed reform is a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. Again, no brainer. Justices would be required to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, and recuse themselves from cases in which they or their spouses have financial or other conflicts of interest. Again, uncontroversial, popular, makes sense, but somebody who disagrees with all of this is Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, appointed by Donald Trump. This is what he had to say during an interview with the Fox Propaganda Network.
But first, Shannon sat down with Justice Neil Gorsuch at the Supreme Court and has his response to President Biden's proposed reforms.
You are not in a bubble here at the court. There are real-world events happening. The president has proposed now changes to the court, supported, it appears, by the vice president, who looks like she's going to be the Democratic nominee. How does the court feel about potential changes, term limits, ethics codes that are enforced by someone in ways that it isn't now?
Shannon, you're not going to be surprised that I'm not going to get into what is now a political issue during a presidential election year. I don't think that would be helpful. I have one thought to add. It is that the independent judiciary means, what does it mean to you as an American? It means that when you're unpopular, you can get a fair hearing under the law and under the Constitution. If you're in the majority, you don't need judges and juries to hear you and protect your rights. You're popular. It's there for the moments when the spotlight's on you, when the government's coming after you. And don't you want a ferociously independent judge and a jury of your peers to make those decisions? Isn't that your right as an American? And so I just say, be careful.
Pretty chilling coming from a sitting United States Supreme Court justice telling the president of the United States, be careful. And there was so much packed into that minute and 15 seconds. It was really just mind boggling. Number one, he's like, listen, Shannon, come on, you know me. It's a presidential election year. I'm not going to weigh in on this sort of thing. And then he proceeds to weigh in anyway. And again, makes it very clear that he opposes any sort of reform or check on the Supreme Court, including, again, these wildly uncontroversial things like ethics requirements. And how he frames it, he's like, listen, don't you want a ferociously independent judiciary? Independent judiciary, independent judiciary. What about a binding code of conduct reduces the independence of the judiciary? Every other court in this country, every other court, every federal court, every state Supreme Court is bound by binding codes of conduct. They can't do whatever the hell they want. They can't receive bribes. They can't receive undisclosed gifts from right-wing or, hypothetically, left-wing billionaires, even though it seems to be a relatively exclusive problem on the right. Are they not independent? Is Justice Gorsuch saying that any court bound by mandatory ethics requirements, like the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals or district courts, are they not independent? Why is it that binding codes of conduct exist for every other court and every other government actor, senators, congresspeople, executive branch officials, the president of the United States, but you 9 justices should be given carte blanche to do whatever the hell you want, whenever you want, receive whatever gifts you want, disclose whatever you want, recuse yourselves whenever you want, no sort of public accountability. How does that reduce your independence? If anything, I would think this would guarantee or better guarantee your independence by saying that you can't be bribed. It's that simple. And again, also the phrasing, this is about the government coming after you. Effectively, he's saying, hey, if we can't receive gifts with impunity and fail to disclose them, because we want to protect our reputation while also milking right-wing billionaires, that what that does is it empowers the government to come after you. Very strange framing, dishonest framing by Justice Gorsuch, but he's not alone. You have Justice Samuel Alito, another right-wing Supreme Court justice who might as well be a MAGA Republican, even though he was appointed long before Donald Trump came into office by President Bush. He told the Wall Street Journal he made headlines for talking about this to the Wall Street Journal. And then the context and content of what he said was even more ridiculous. This is an excerpt from the Wall Street Journal last year. This is what Alito said. Justice Alito said he voluntarily follows disclosure statutes that apply to lower court judges and executive branch officials. Again, mandatory for them, but voluntary for him and the other 8 Supreme Court justices. But he notes that, quote, Congress did not create the Supreme Court, end quote. The Constitution did. Quote, I know this is a controversial view, but I'm willing to say it. No provision in the Constitution gives them, Congress, the authority to regulate the Supreme Court, period. We'll come back to that in just a second. Do the other justices agree? Quote, I don't know that any of my colleagues have spoken about it publicly, so I don't think I should say, but I think it is something we've all thought about. So again, before we get into what his colleagues have to say, let's go to Article 3 of the Constitution, which deals with the judiciary. Okay. Does Congress have the power to regulate the Supreme Court? Yes, obviously. And even if you doubted that, well, the Constitution says it very clearly. This is one example. In all the other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. They even use the word regulate. It's right here, black and white, plain text of the Constitution, that Congress in certain areas does indeed have the power to regulate the Supreme Court and make exceptions to the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdictions. And by the way, what about notions of checks and balances, right? Checks and balances, is this constitutional doctrine which says that all 3 branches can influence the activity of the other branches. They can check, they can balance, they can influence. But Alito and Gorsuch seem to be thinking, no, checks and balances apply to the other branches. And we can check and balance them, but they can't do anything to us. We are above them. They're inferior. They're lesser. Well, liberal Justice Elena Kagan disagrees. So after Alito made his remarks to the Wall Street Journal, she was asked about this, and she kind of gave pretty bold remarks as well. I mean, bold in the sense that, it's a Supreme Court justice making kind of a political statement, but also a statement which is pretty self-evident and backed by the Constitution and separation of powers and checks and balances. So she says, quote, it just can't be that the court is the only institution that somehow is not subject to checks and balances from anybody else. We're not imperial. Kagan told the audience of judges and lawyers attending the Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference. Can Congress do various things to regulate the Supreme Court? I think the answer is yes, and of course they can. My God, the Constitution or the Congress is the one who decides even the size of the court. They're the ones who, by federal statutes, shortly after the Civil War, set the number of Supreme Court justices to 9. They've shrank it in the past. They've expanded it in the past. Just this idea that the court should be above checks and balances is anti-American and it's unconstitutional. It's super gross, especially coming from sitting Supreme Court justices like Gorsuch and Alito. As a matter of fact, Kagan in the past couple of weeks has actually made a formal recommendation about how exactly, the ethics requirements could be manifest in terms of like an enforcement mechanism. So this is from July 25th. Kagan suggested that Chief Justice John Roberts could appoint an outside panel of highly respected, experienced judges to review allegations of wrongdoing by the justices, some of whom have faced questions in recent years over unreported gifts of luxury travel, book deals, and potential conflicts of interest in key cases. So Kagan and the liberals seem all on board with this idea that, ethics requirements, totally fair. And we should all be subject to them, including the liberals. And the other thing I just want to say, going back to Gorsuch, this appeal to popularity. Hey, listen, popular people, we don't have to worry about protecting their rights. Popular ideas, you don't have to worry about protecting their rights. What about unpopularity? Well, speaking of unpopularity, I think it is important to remind people that the Supreme Court is wildly unpopular. They have a 40% approval rating. By a 9-point margin, more Americans believe that the Supreme Court is, quote, making decisions that protect Donald Trump, quote, 44%, than believe that the Supreme Court is making decisions that ensure Trump is treated fairly under the law. So Not only do they have an historically low approval rating, but more Americans than not believe that this court is actually politically biased in favor of Trump, that they care more about protecting Trump than making sure he's being treated fairly. Not worse than other people and not better than other people. It's pretty bad. With respect to presidential immunity, 78%, nearly 80% of Americans believe that that was the wrong decision. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity, Americans overwhelmingly agree that no president is above the law. 78%. Imagine in today's political climate getting 78% of Americans to agree that the sky is blue. But 58% of Republicans, 87% of independents, and 94% of Democrats believe that the court ruled wrongly and that no president should be above the law. And then perhaps the most damning statistic, a majority of Americans do not trust the Supreme Court to make the right decisions in the future, by 52%. So, folks, this is, again, going all the way back to Gorsuch. It's really chilling that he issued a public warning to the president, like, hey, don't you dare try to check us. Don't you dare try to make us subject to checks and balances. We get to impose them from on high on the rest of you. We're better than you, Mr. President. We're better than senators and Congress people. We're 9 unelected philosopher God kings who get to do whatever the hell we want. And if you dare try to treat us the way that we were intended to be treated, the weakest branch, a branch that's also subject to checks and balances like Congress and the executive, then, you better be careful. Be careful. I don't know what the hell that means and how that be careful will manifest in the future. But I think it's something worth noting that a Supreme Court justice is that adamantly opposed to any sort of common sense and popular check and balance against them. Really unhinged stuff. Let me know what you think in the comments.